As many of you guys know, we're growing a ton of vegetable crops this year. I'm so excited for it, but that means we need a lot of one thing. That black gold. None other than good old worm poop. So in today's video, we're going to show you guys how to make your very own 3-tiered worm composting bin. This is so easy to make, and you actually only need a couple of tools and materials to make it as well. You'll need some 5-gallon buckets, a drill, some drill bits, and also a spigot for the very bottom layer is really great for getting out that worm compost tea. And trust me, I really promise you guys that this is so simple and easy to make. A lot of the times, the reason why we don't do things around the garden is because we just think it's going to be too complicated or too hard to maintain. But this foolproof system is so easy. With the 3 tiers, on that very bottom tier is going to be providing you with the compost tea, as I said before, that you can spread throughout your gardens as soon as it is ready. And then the next layer above that is going to be providing that really rich, dark, almost black in color compost that is completely composted, full of worm poop and nutrients, that is also going to be ready to amend into your soil. And then the next tier on top of that is where we add in all of our kitchen scraps and compost, from whether if you have garden scraps that you throw in there, fresh greens, anything that you're providing the worms to eat, you're going to throw all that into this top layer. And this 3-tiered system is so great because it allows you to exchange those top 2 levels depending on where your compost is and if it's ready to be added to your garden. Once it is, you just dump that second tier out into the garden and then put it on top of your old tier, so then that kitchen scraps that has been composting for say a few weeks to a month is now going to become your second tier, and that's going to be your next tier that you empty out into the garden while you start adding kitchen scraps and compost into the next top bucket. So you just rotate these along with the emptying of the very bottom tray for your compost tea to make an incredible amendment for your soil throughout the entire year. And then later in this video, after we make the actual compost bins, I'm going to show you guys how we can scrounge around in the backyard just to find the materials that we would need to make our very first layer when starting out if you don't have any soil or compost already made. Alright, let's get to making this thing. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm so excited for this episode. Alright, we're out here in the garage. We've got our 3 old buckets that we'll be using. Just any old 5-gallon pail works great for this. You can pick these up at Home Depot for pretty cheap. And like I said before, these are going to be layered just like this. So your very bottom bucket is going to be for your compost tea. The next one is for that compost that is going to be real close to ready for the garden. And then the top layer where you've got most of that space is going to be for your new kitchen scraps that you'll be adding. So the first thing that we're going to be doing is taking our second tiered bucket. So this is going to be our first layer, then our second layer, and we're going to be drilling 1/4-inch holes in the bottom of here. Because this one is primarily going to be letting all of the liquids flow through, that's why we're going with a 1/4-inch drill bit on this one. There we go, that one is all set. If you can see those holes all over that's going to let that liquid flow through. Now our next one is going to be for a 1/2-inch hole. That's because we want a larger diameter of hole for the worms to work their way through back and forth between the second and third bucket here. And then a lot of that composted material is also going to slowly work its way down to the bottom bucket as those worms turn it all up. As you can see, a little bit larger holes on that one. This is a 1/2-inch drill bit. And lastly, we've got our lid. We also need to drill holes all in the top of this for aeration purposes. That way it lets a little bit of airflow go in there and helps provide all the oxygen needed for the composition process in the worms. For this one, we are going to be using 1/8 inch or a 1/4 inch drill bit and put a ton of holes in the top of it here. I've also seen people use mesh, so if you use a really small diameter mesh to put around the top here so it gets enough airflow to provide the oxygen, but you don't want too much to where it's going to be sticking up wherever you have it. If you've got it outside in a place where you don't want to be smelling compost. I mean, generally you don't smell the compost that much anyways, but if you're sensitive to it, make sure you don't put a giant hole in here with the mesh around it. I still advise to put in like 1/2 inch holes and then the mesh over it. But if you don't want to do mesh or don't have the mesh, use a 1/4 inch or 1/8 inch holes there. And there we go, we've got a bunch of 1/8 inch holes here. I will say, if you do seem like you're having problems with your worms crawling up out of this bin and container, then that mesh might be needed. But for the most part, if you've got this thing outside, you really don't have to worry about losing that worm population, because they're going to be reproducing so fast inside of this compost bin that the amount of worms that maybe have a small chance of crawling out of it by attaching to the side of this and crawling up by using the moisture and stuff that's on the side of the container, I mean, that very small amount is going to be completely negligible. But if you do seem like you're having a lot of issues with it, just a quick tip is to use that mesh. So now we've got all 3 of our layers here. One thing you can do is add a spigot down at the bottom on this lower container. That way when it fills up with this worm tea, you can drain it out into a container and then take that out into your garden. I don't have a spigot here, so what I'm gonna do for the time being until we get one shipped to us, I'll just be taking off the bottom bucket and then dumping it into the garden like that. You don't really need a spigot, but it's just for ease of use for when you're using that compost tea down out of that bottom. So now let's head out into the backyard and see what we can gather to start our very own worm compost bin here. Okay, welcome to the greenhouse. It is too windy to do any sort of filming outside with dialogue, so I figured I would come in here with you guys. As you can tell from the video, we've got a whole mix of different types of compounds, including some of the soil that we've got in our raised garden bed. The reason why I included that soil is because there's a lot of microorganisms and bacteria living in that soil that is going to help the new worms establish in the compost. It really helps them digest the compost and get started. Without that bacteria and microorganisms, it's just a little bit more difficult and can be pretty hard on them to start out. So that's why I definitely recommend doing that. If you have a garden bed or a compost pile already, definitely use that. We also put in some old leaves from last season. We got some compost out of our tumbling compost bin. And then we also dug underneath our compost that we put all of our deadheadings and trimmings from our perennial flower garden beds. We dug under there and got some of that half composted stuff. So it's going to be a really nice starter material. And we also got some egg cartons and cardboard in that. The reason why you want to add a mixture of all of this stuff is because if you only do food scraps, that mixture is going to end up so wet and soggy and nasty that the worms are going to have a really, really hard time developing in there and eating that stuff up. They could do it eventually, but you definitely don't want to do only food scraps. Mix in stuff like scrap pieces of paper, newspaper, if you've got shredded paper, cardboard, egg cartons, all of that stuff will work great for you guys. And then there's also one more ingredient that we have to add to aid in the digestion for the worms. This right here, good old eggshells. This is going to help break down the food in the worm's digestive tract. So if you think about them going through the soil, normally there's going to be sand, rocks, some thick minerals, things of that nature that's going to help break down the food as it's going through their digestive tract. And that's kind of what you're replicating with eggshells. You do want to make sure that you either cook these eggshells or throw them in an oven for a period of time. I look up I think it was like 185 degrees for a couple of hours for these eggshells. Otherwise, if you make hard-boiled eggs, those eggshells are fine to put in your compost right away. But otherwise, if you don't do that, there's a possibility that you're spreading salmonella throughout your compost. So really, to be safe, I definitely recommend cooking or baking your eggshells before you put them in your compost. Just make sure that you and your family are safe in case there were any sort of salmonella contamination in there. So we've got about a quarter cup in here, and we're just going to spread that in. Mix it up with all of our material, and that's going to be it. If you guys do have a worm population that you want to use, and you have some native worms that you're sure you want in your compost, you can go ahead and do that. Find a bunch of those worms by turning over logs, rocks, things like that, and throw them into your compost bin, and you can start a colony off that way. Otherwise, you can go online and buy your very own like worm starting kits. Usually red wigglers are going to be your preferred species of worm. So stay tuned for a future video on where we're going to be buying our worms, showing you guys them going into the compost, and then from there on we're going to be documenting the process that this worm bin goes through, just to kind of show how fast this stuff breaks down and how beneficial it can be for your garden. And this stuff is just really, really incredible. If you don't have a worm bin at home, I highly suggest making one. Especially, you know, that's why you're watching this video. You're looking to see if it's a viable option for you. And I think it definitely is. It's so easy to do, very cost effective, and it creates some incredible vegetables in the garden if you use this stuff. This is so great not only for vegetable gardens, but if you've got a perennial flower garden bed that might be struggling a little bit, just add in some of this compost for some great results. Your plants are absolutely going to love it. So thank you guys all so much for watching today. I hope your gardening adventures are going great this spring. I know I've been so busy. We've got a ton of stuff going around in the garden. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Please subscribe if you found entertainment and enjoyment and maybe even learned a little bit out of today's video. Thank you all. We'll see you in the next video, and happy gardening.